Hey friends, Patrina here with Homegrown Florida. I know you guys have been asking me a lot for different kinds of recipes using stuff from the garden, so I thought I'd do a little bit of a twist on it. And we're going to do 6 recipes today where we're actually using things that we have harvested from the garden throughout the entire year and how I've processed them in different ways and how we're going to use them today to make 6 meals, 2 breakfast, 2 lunch, and 2 dinner. Let's start with breakfast. We're starting out with a strawberry banana smoothie. I'm also going to be doing a mixed berry smoothie, and that all started with my brilliant strawberry harvest. These are berries called Brilliants. I have also grown Chandler and the Albicon before, but I really never had such a successful harvest until I started growing the Brilliants. And I grew them in a green stock container, and I have about 30 plants in this green stock vertical planter. It gave me a tremendous harvest this year, and so a lot of those I ended up preserving in lots of different ways. So one of the first ways was that I made jam. I made a strawberry banana jam. You can get the theme here. I really love strawberry and banana together as a combination. I also made some standard strawberry jelly from the tops of the strawberries that were kind of waste. And then I froze a bunch and made freeze-dried strawberries, and I had this bag in the freezer of kind of the leftover ones that didn't make it onto the freeze-drying trays. And so that's what kind of led to this idea of doing these smoothies. The other thing was in my fridge, I had this container of yogurt. And for some reason, we just don't eat yogurt very often in this house, and it was getting close to being near that end of date. And so I thought, why don't I try freezing it? Freezing milk products don't always turn out great, mainly because the fat in the milk separates when you freeze it. But I figured since I'm using this in smoothies and it's going to get blended up anyway, that it would probably be fine. This recipe was inspired by Panera. So Panera has a strawberry banana yogurt smoothie, and I absolutely adore it, but I think it's like $6 the last time I checked. It's like $6 for one of these. And I thought, well, I have these strawberries. I have this like near expired yogurt. Why don't I try making that same smoothie at home? I looked up the ingredients, and the ingredients are just strawberry, bananas, and yogurt. So I thought, okay, let me freeze all of these fruits and see if I can make it taste the same. And it tastes amazing, by the way. So I took my remaining half bag of frozen strawberries, and I'm mixing them up with a few things. So the first one being the bananas and the yogurt. And I'm going to store these a little bit differently in preparation for an RV trip that we have coming up. I'm going to store them in vacuum sealed bags. So the first thing I wanted to do was first make myself a smoothie and make sure that it does taste as good as I remember. I did have to add some water to it. I think that if I had allowed the strawberries and the bananas to defrost a little bit, or maybe the yogurt to defrost, it would have blended a little bit better without the water. And I think it would have been more a stronger strawberry banana taste. With the water, it kind of watered it down a little bit. So in the future, I'll probably pull these out the night before or a few hours before and put them on the countertop, and then stick them in my little magic bullet blender to blend them up. Besides the strawberry and banana, I also had some leftover blackberries, and then I purchased some blueberries. My blueberry plants did not do well this year, so unfortunately I didn't have any blueberries that I could use for this recipe, but I did have some of those blackberries. So with the strawberries, the blackberries, the purchased blueberries, and then that yogurt, I made these little packets. Now these packets are going to be great when I'm on the road, so that I don't have to be carrying around a lot of fresh fruit that sometimes goes bad in a RV refrigerator. Since an RV refrigerator isn't always great at keeping temperature, the freezer is much better. So then that way I have them in these little packs. They're already measured out to the perfect amount to make a smoothie with. So the next recipe we're going to be making for breakfast is egg bites. I have had a great onion harvest this year. It was my first year that I had such a good onion harvest. I also had a really good hot pepper harvest. Not necessarily a great sweet pepper harvest, but I did get a decent amount, probably enough for a year on the sweet peppers, definitely enough for 3 years on the hot peppers. And the onions is definitely a year's supply for us as well. So the sweet peppers and the hot peppers, the way that I've been preserving them is I have been keeping them either in the freezer in vacuum seal packs, and I've also been freeze drying them so that that way we have them for even longer. The onions, I cured them and hung them in my pantry. I also froze some chopped onions, and then I freeze dried some onions to make some onion powder. All of these ways were incredibly delicious. Oh, and then I also took some of those peppers and freeze dried chili so that that way it's one of those meals on the go. But for this recipe, I took some actually out of the freezer, chopped it up, and then I added to it some little tomatoes. So these would be great if I had some tomatoes in the garden right now that I was producing, but I don't. So I actually had to purchase tomatoes. This is really the first tomato purchase I've made in a really long time. Usually my tomatoes will last me over the seasons where we can't grow them, but this time of year is one of those times when I actually don't have any tomatoes except in the freezer, and I really wanted to start with fresh tomatoes. I also had some bacon that I'm chopping up. This is going to go great. I'm mirroring this recipe after the Starbucks bacon and Gruyere egg bites. I'm never sure if I'm pronouncing that cheese correctly, but I wanted to make it like that, but I wanted to add some veggies. They also have one that is like a pepper, like a egg white pepper Starbucks egg bite that I really like as well. So it's kind of a mix between those two. I'm doing 6 eggs into a blender, and I found that the trick for egg bites to make them taste most like the Starbucks egg bites is to add cottage cheese and cornstarch. So I'm going to be adding 1 1/4 cup cottage cheese. I'm then going to be adding 1 cup of cheese, and you can use whatever cheese you like. I used grated cheese out of a bag, and I would strongly encourage you maybe not to do this, or maybe to blend the cheese up first before adding the wet ingredients, because it kind of caked up. And I suspect that that has to do with how much like flour and anti-caking stuff that they put on pre-grated cheese. You could also grate your own cheese. I think that would be even better, and probably would have turned out good. I mean, they were amazing regardless, but that probably would have helped. So then, you know, you see me here putting in the cornstarch, and that's going to be 2 tablespoons of the cornstarch, and then some salt and pepper. Make sure to have those 6 eggs in there, and then you're going to blend it up for just a couple minutes until you can't see any pieces. When you're cooking the egg bites, it's not something as simple as adding them to a muffin tin or a silicone baking mold. You actually have to cook them in such a way so that the eggs don't get rubbery and they don't create like a crust along the edge. So I'm starting out by putting my ingredients into a muffin tin. Make sure to grease your muffin tin well. I'm starting out by adding my peppers, and then I'm going to add my tomatoes. Now, after I've added the veggies, I decided to hold off on adding the bacon because I know that when you add your egg mixture, everything's going to kind of float. So I kind of want my bacon to be at the top of the muffin, or at the top of the egg bite. So I'm going to pour the mixture first. Then once I've finished pouring it, I'm going to put the pieces of bacon on the top and just kind of tap them in just slightly so that that way they kind of hover in the top space. This is going to mean that the veggies kind of float in the center, and then the bacon pieces are up top. You don't have to do this. It's just kind of how I prefer doing it. I ended up doing 2 different batches of this. So this first one is that veggie and bacon and cheese. And then the next batch I made, I kind of ran out of veggies and I ran out of bacon. So I just made the egg mixture, so nothing mixed in. I just poured the egg mixture into the muffin tins, and then I put them in the oven. And I gotta tell you that it seems like my favorite way to eat them is just the cheese and egg mixture, because it was so creamy and it really did have that texture that the Starbucks egg bites have, whereas the one with the veggies and the bacon, they were really good, but I think that the texture, that silky texture that you're looking for in an egg bite, kind of gets lost with so many ingredients. So I think this is one of those recipes that less is more. Maybe just the bacon and the cheese. Now, how you cook them is kind of special. So you can do this two ways. The first way is you can put a container, whether that a baking dish basically, with some boiling hot water at the bottom of your oven, and then put the tray of egg bites in the center part of the oven. The way that I'm doing it here is I'm actually doing it kind of like you would a cheesecake. So I put the egg bite muffin tin inside of a larger, I think this is one of those throwaway lasagna pans, and then I filled that with the boiling water from my kettle. And then I put that into the oven at 300 for about 20 to 25 minutes, just enough for the eggs to set. And if you've ever made a cheesecake and you kind of get that little wobble when you shake it, that's what you're looking for in these egg bites. I prefer this method that I did, even though it's a little more cumbersome to get them in and out, because I feel like if you just did the tray of the baking dish of water at the bottom, that it wouldn't give you the right texture along the edges. So the top of the egg bite is great, but when you start cutting around to pop them out, without that water kind of heated and boiling around them as like a water bath, I think it would probably create too much of a crust. And you really want these like silky smooth. And so that's what ended up happening because I did it that way. I did the water bath. And they turned out amazing. So much like Starbucks that I don't know if I'm ever buying Starbucks again. Our next recipe is going to be a lunch recipe, and this is going to be Greek salad in a jar. I've seen these all over TikTok, Instagram for years, and I just think they are so cool. I'm like, they remind me of back in the day. I'm kind of getting nostalgic and probably showing my age, of the McDonald's shaker salads. I don't know if you guys remember this. If you do, head down to the comments. Don't make me feel alone here. But it starts out with harvesting these onions back in early, I think it was mid-spring actually. And then I had some al dente peppers, some ripe red ones, which I thought would be really pretty in this salad. And then we had some onions, particularly the red onions that have been curing in my pantry. We're going to start out by making the dressing first. So the dressing is 1 clove of minced garlic, a half a cup of red wine vinegar, 2/3 of a cup of oil, 1 tablespoon of an Italian seasoning, 1 teaspoon of onion powder, 1 tablespoon of mustard. I used yellow mustard just because I didn't have ground mustard, but if you have like ground or those Grey Poupon type mustards, you're going to want to use that one. Then you're going to do about 1/4 of a cup of feta, and then some salt and pepper for seasoning. This is a pretty vinegar heavy recipe, so if you're not really that into vinegars, you might want to use a more basic vinegar like an apple cider vinegar, or you could even cut the vinegar in half and use more oil. You could make it more of a creamy Greek dressing by adding maybe sour cream or mayonnaise, all of that. The one thing I absolutely love about dressings in general is that you can make them however you want. It's one of the reasons why I pretty much make all my dressings now. I don't really buy them anymore because I like certain things. I like a heavy vinegar. I like cheese in my dressing. I like certain kind of seasonings, and you can make a dressing exactly how you want it by making it on your own. And it's phenomenal in this recipe. I absolutely love this one. Very strong flavors, goes extremely well with the Greek ingredients that we're going to be talking about in a second for the salad. Now these salads in a jar are really cool because of the way that you're going to layer them. It's in a way that keeps the salad as fresh as possible. I don't know about you, but when I was working before I retired, I loved taking salad to work, and I bought all these little specialty salad containers to try to keep the dressing separated from the salad, because all the vegetables and the lettuce is going to get kind of mushy and nasty if it sits in a salad dressing. Well, that's all solved here with these salads in a jar because it pretty much separates the ingredients naturally, but instead of carrying these bulky containers, you're just carrying one mason jar. So it starts out with, you always want to put your salad dressing at the very bottom. Then what you want to do is you want to put the items of the salad that can handle holding up to the dressing. So that's olives to start with. You should use Kalamata. I only had green olives, so that's what I used. And then I used onions because I like pickled onions. And basically these onions sitting in the bottom of the jar with the olives is going to absorb up all of that salad dressing. And then I went with the red peppers next because they are a little more heartier, then the cucumbers, then the tomatoes. These are the softer vegetables that can absorb some of that salad dressing and start getting mushy, so they kind of go at the top. Cheese, nuts, seeds, whatever you want to add, those are up at the very top. And then right above that is all of the lettuce. Now this salad has a lot of ingredients, so it doesn't have a significant amount of lettuce, but once we dump this out, I'm going to show you that it's just perfect for a Greek salad in terms of how you always want all of those special ingredients with it. But you could totally cut down on the number of vegetables and little additions and instead put about half of a quart-sized jar full of the lettuce and get a lot more of a traditional salad. You can also vacuum seal these jars shut, and I hear that they last a really long time in the refrigerator that way. Don't tip them over until you're ready to actually dump the salad out and eat it. But if you were to vacuum seal them and stick them in the fridge, I've seen some people where that lasts for like 5, 6, 7. Somebody even claimed 10 days. I'm questionable on that one. But when you're ready to eat it, you're just going to kind of shake it around, and then you're going to dump it out into a plate, and all of that goodness just kind of pours right on top of the salad. It's like the perfect bowl of Greek salad. The next recipe comes from my basil harvest. I had a really good basil harvest this year. I had this one plant in the green stalk that just never wanted to stop producing basil. I would cut it all the way back thinking that I killed the plant at that point, and it would just regrow. And it has been going all summer long, all spring, into the fall. This plant just won't die. But that's kind of not very typical for me. Normally my basil bolts and it doesn't taste really good anymore. This one has been kind of a special basil. But there is a different kind of basil that I grew this year that actually did even better than any basil I've ever grown before. And it's called Marihani basil. Looks a little different than traditional basil, but has the same taste. And it really is meant for warm weather, and it does grow all through summer. It was so nice to have basil pretty much all year round. So for this pesto panini, we're going to start by making some bread. So the bread that I'm making is a sourdough bread, and the recipe that I follow for my sourdough is a 90-gram starter. I usually do 385 grams of water, but this time I did 370 because it has been raining, and here in Florida it's very, very humid. Then I did 12 grams of salt and 520 grams of bread flour. Now, as I was mixing this, I kind of realized that 370 grams of water was probably a little too low. I ended up with a very, very dry dough. And for those of you who've done sourdough bread, you know that sourdough is a very, very wet, sticky, very high hydration dough. And so mine was very, very dry. So I ended up, it felt like a mistake at first, but I was very, very happy with the result. Isn't it funny how like when you make a mistake and you just try to work with it, if you just keep going, sometimes you find recipes that you absolutely love. And basically what I found during this recipe was that by adding less water and slowly adding it back in through my stretch and folds, which is something that you do to this bread. So you let it set, you put a towel over it, you let it set, and then you come back and you do 3 or 4 rounds of stretches and folds. Well, I couldn't really stretch and fold it because it really wasn't stretching. So I ended up kneading it. And kneading it is going to create a denser crumb inside of the bread, which is actually really, really good for making sandwich bread. And I have had such a hard time finding a good sourdough sandwich bread that like works really well. And so I stumbled upon this. So I ended up adding back some water by putting water on my hand as I needed it instead of doing stretches and folds. And I did this 3 or 4 times, and then I let it set overnight on my counter for 12 hours. And after it had set on the counter for 24 hours, that is called the bulk fermentation stage, I laid it out onto the counter and I started to shape it. And at this point, it's kind of like a big old blob. It's really, really hard to work with. But really all you're just trying to do is not add any flour and instead just kind of spread it out and start trying to create some tension by folding it in on itself. And then you just keep working around and working around. And eventually what you'll notice is that instead of being sticky, it starts to get more of a spring to it. I don't even know how to explain it, but you just got to keep kind of working and spinning and working and spinning, and it creates this tension and it's easier to deal with. From that point, then I add it to my Banneton basket. I didn't used to have these, but I kind of like having them now. You could just use a bowl, like a glass bowl or a plastic bowl or whatever you have. Just make sure that you either put parchment paper down or rice flour, not regular flour, and that will help it from sticking. I set it in my refrigerator for a couple of hours for the cold ferment process, and then I took it out here and then I scored it on some parchment paper. I put it into my Dutch oven and I put the top on my Dutch oven. While all this was happening, I set my temperature to my oven to 500 degrees and I let that preheat for 30 minutes. You really want that oven to have no cold spots in it, so you really want it to heat evenly. And I even put my Dutch oven in there while it's preheating so that the Dutch oven itself is not cold either. I cook that for 25 minutes and then I take the top off, reduce the temperature to 450, and then let it cook a little bit longer. Now, I don't like my bread to be super crispy, the crust. Some people really do. That's why my loaves are a little bit lighter. We like, a softer crust. We don't like a very hard crust like some people do when they're making sourdough bread. So for us, an additional 10 minutes uncovered is perfect. But if you do want it to be darkened and you want it to be crispy, you're just going to need to increase that time to maybe another 20 minutes. I was just really happy with the way that this crumb come out. When I have done my sourdough bread in the past and did the stretch and fold and used a higher hydration, I ended up with kind of like big bubbles in my bread. And I know that that's usually a sign of over fermenting, so I've really been working on that. But now I realize through this accident that by reducing the hydration and kneading instead of the stretches and folds seems to have created like this perfect loaf for me, or at least for my family and the way that we like to eat our bread. It was outstanding. So we're going to cut this bread up. While this bread was being cut, I had taken out my little pesto pucks. So all that basil we had harvested from the Marihani basil and the regular basil from the green stalk that just wouldn't quit, I had blended that up earlier in the season with some garlic and some oil and some walnuts. You can use pine nuts if you want to be more traditional. And then I created little pucks using I think that was like a cookie scoop, and then I flash froze them on a cookie sheet, and then I took them out and I put them in this little baggie. So I'm letting that defrost for a couple minutes while I cut the bread, and then we're going to chop up some more of those tomatoes that I purchased. I also have some sliced mozzarella here. I wanted the ball of mozzarella, but unfortunately they didn't have that. They only had this sliced stuff. It just doesn't melt the same as like a good mozzarella, like a homemade mozzarella, but it was fine. It still tasted really good. So our pesto is all melted and it's just like pesto. The only thing I don't add to my pesto when I put it in the freezer is Parmesan cheese. So that is a traditional ingredient in pesto that you would want to add now at this point, now that it is defrosted. So I layered on the pesto and then I added my sliced mozzarella, and then on top of that I put my tomatoes. Now I made a mistake in this recipe because I took some more of the fresh basil. I was thinking like the fresh basil would be really fun to use as like a lettuce, but I put that on and then I stuck the whole thing in the toaster oven. I shouldn't have done that. I should have kept the basil off of it and just let the pesto, cheese, and tomatoes and bread into the toaster oven. So that way the lettuce would, well, not lettuce, the basil would still be crispy and behave like a lettuce. Instead, it kind of wilted and became like a, I don't know, like a cooked spinach. It was still exceptional. It was still very good, but don't make the mistake I did. Leave the basil off of it before you put it in the toaster oven. And I put it in the toaster oven under my toast setting for at number 5, I believe it was. I think that's basically like 4 or 5 minutes in the toaster. When it came out really, really beautiful. It was warm, the bread was nice and toasty, the cheese was starting to melt, but still had some structure to it. It was very lovely. And at this point, I should have opened the sandwich and put the basil on and added my balsamic glaze. Do not forget the balsamic glaze, guys. It is so good. You could use regular balsamic vinegar if you have a thicker balsamic vinegar. But I like to use these glazes, but they're just easier to use. And then I cut it in half, and that was our lunch for the day. So on to our next recipe, which is our first dinner recipe. That's going to be the black bean and veggie quesadilla. The star of this particular recipe are these Puerto Rican black beans. Technically, the Puerto Rican black bean is a cowpea, so it's not technically a black bean. But these guys were the star of the summer garden. They produced so, so well. I think I ended up with about 2-gallon sized jars, mason jars full of black beans from, let's see here, 2, 4, 6 plants. That was it. Just 6 plants produced 2 gallons of black beans. I don't think this is a full year supply of our black beans, but it's definitely a jump start for a full year. I also had used some of the onions. I've noticed that between the red and the white onions, the red ones were supposed to last longer in storage, but they're the ones that are sprouting first. My white onions are actually lasting much longer than the red ones, which is very strange to me because they were only supposed to last about 2 or 3 months, but here we are several months later. I think we're at the 6-month mark, and they are still doing fine in the pantry, and not one single one of them have sprouted yet. In this recipe, I'm also using some unripened al dulce peppers, so al dulce peppers that are in the green state. I took some of the onions. These were chopped from an earlier recipe that I had done, and I had some left over, so I just put them in a container and stuck them in the fridge until I was ready to do this one. So we're going to saute those onions. I think that's probably maybe 1/3 cup. And then I'm going to add an equal amount of these frozen al dulce peppers. Besides the al dulce peppers and the onions, we're also going to be adding the Puerto Rican black beans. Now, the Puerto Rican black beans, I usually keep them dry, but every month or 2, I will make about 4 or 5 quarts and I will can them. So I don't follow the traditional canning recipe. I know, rebel over here, but I soak my beans overnight, and then I drain off that water, and then I put fresh water in, and then I pressure cook them. I believe I think it's 70 minutes. I could be wrong. Could be 90 minutes. I'll have to look back at the recipe. And then I pressure can them, and then they're good and they're shelf-stable. And this is mainly just to make them convenient so that you can take them out of the jar and use them on anything you want, and they're already fully cooked. So I'm going to let the bean and veggie mixture saute on the oven, and saute on the stove there, and then I'm adding some seasoning. I went with salt, pepper, cumin, cayenne, garlic, and onion powder. While that was cooking, I laid out my tortillas. Now, yes, I could have made my own tortillas, but I actually purchased these because I just didn't feel like getting out the rolling pin and rolling tortillas out. They're kind of a pain in the butt for me with how thin you have to roll them. But I added cream cheese. Now, this is the winner, guys. I added cream cheese to 1/2 of my tortillas. I sprinkled it with cheese and I put half of my veggie and bean mixture on there. And then I folded it in half. Oh, sorry, I added some cheese to it. This is the glue. This is what holds these together. And then I folded it over, and I can do 2 quesadillas this way in a larger style pan, because I can put one on one side and I can put one on the other side and let them cook together. It just doubles the recipe. I like doing it this way, this folded approach, rather than doing like a flat one and then one on top, just because I feel like the fold helps keep the ingredients inside so much better than if you just do like a whole one on top of the other. They kind of fall out the sides and everything. With 1/2 of the sides, folded, it keeps everything tucked in nice and neat, kind of like an omelet. Now I'm going to let them cook on low here just so that the tortilla gets nice and crispy. You want that crispy outer tortilla shell. And if you do them too quickly, you're just going to kind of burn the tortilla. So you really just want to like set it on low and kind of just let it sit there and do its thing. Don't really mess with it for about 5 to 7 minutes. While they're cooking, I just opened a jar of my restaurant style salsa, and with this we had harvested tomatoes early spring, harvested the onions late spring, the peppers all summer long, and then the garlic late spring as well. And I made a batch of this restaurant salsa. I got it from the Ball recipe of, I think it was their roasted tomato salsa recipe. I'm using a pizza cutter to cut into 3 pieces for each one of these, and then we're going to just serve these with that restaurant style salsa. Incredibly good. If you are more of a meat eater, you could substitute the beans for ground beef or shredded chicken. All of that would be just as well. But I'm a big fan of these Puerto Rican black beans, so I kind of wanted them to be the stars of the show for this particular recipe. The next recipe we're going to be working on is our last dinner recipe, and that's going to be the pulled pork sliders. It starts out with our garlic that we harvested late spring. I had a bunch that split, but they still worked out great. There were several that didn't split, and even some of the ones that did split, I went ahead and cured them, and they have been storing pretty well. I've actually been pretty shocked. We're going to use some of the onions that we cured and hung, and then also the green stalk herbs. We're using the Italian blend that I make with the oregano, the basil, and the parsley. So we're going to chop up our onions first. So for this recipe, we're making a sauce, and that sauce is diced onion, so 1 diced onion, 3 diced garlic cloves, 1 cup of barbecue sauce, 2 tablespoons of mustard. You can use ground mustard or the yellow mustard, a teaspoon of Worcester sauce. I can never say that correctly. Then we're going to do 2 tablespoons apple cider vinegar, a 1/2 cup of broth. This is my homemade chicken broth. I use the carcasses of the chicken, and then I put them in my Instapot for about 4 or 5 hours, and I let them cook at a high pressure so that we create a very, very flavorful broth. Then we're going to add about 1/2 cup of brown sugar, some of that Italian seasoning with the oregano that we dried from the garden, salt, pepper, cayenne, and then I have some dehydrated hot peppers. So I thought that that would be good, adding a little bit of sweet and spice to these pulled pork. I don't know if this is like a traditional pulled pork recipe. I think that it tends to be a little bit sweeter and a little bit thicker. But this is just, the flavors that I like. So feel free to adjust it to whatever recipe that you want to do. I had picked up a pork shoulder. You could also use a pork butt. And a lot of people, when they do pulled pork in an Instapot, they will sear it first. I'm lazy. I don't do that. I just kind of put it in, pour the sauce on top, and then I let it pressure cook for 3 hours on high. This one was so large that I realized that when I opened it that it wasn't quite done yet, because when you take 2 forks to it, it should just kind of fall apart on its own, and mine was really still, the tendons were very tight and the meat was still tucked together very, very hard. So I ended up putting it in for another 2 hours to pressure cook, and that worked out perfectly. It took me so long to get into an Instapot. Honestly, I just got my Instapot this last year. And the main reason why I even got an Instapot was because I was sick of doing my broth on the stove. Because when you do your broth on the stove, it has to cook for like 2 days straight. And that means overnight I have to take it off the stove and stick it in the fridge. And then I've got to let it warm up a little bit and cool down. It's just a whole process. When I knew that I could pressure cook it in an Instapot in 4 or 5 hours, which would save me that whole overnight step that I just wasn't really thrilled about. So that's why I got it. But then I started to realize that when I'm doing my pot roast or my shredded porks or my shredded chickens that, sometimes take several hours in a Dutch oven in the oven to cook and really break down and create a very soft texture to the meat, that the Instapot is phenomenal for this. Or, boiling eggs or cooking rice. Like, all of it is so much easier in an Instapot, and I can't believe I waited so long to do it. So while the pork was cooking, I also wanted to make a coleslaw to go on top of the meat inside of the slider. So kind of like the lettuce component. For the dressing, I start out with a half a cup of mayo, 1 tablespoon of white wine vinegar, but you could also use apple cider vinegar or just regular white vinegar, a tablespoon of lemon juice, salt, pepper. I like to add dehydrated celery powder to mine. I take the tops off of my celery, all the fluffy leafy parts, and I dehydrate them and turn them into a powder. It's one of my favorite things to add to coleslaw. And then I'm using some freeze-dried garlic and onion powder. Of course, you can use dehydrated garlic and onion powder. Now, if you like your coleslaw sweet, I don't. I prefer it more tangy. But if you like it sweet, here is where you would want to add maybe a tablespoon of sugar. And then you're going to mix that up. And the reason why you want to make this early, like while it's cooking, is because you want this mix to sit in the refrigerator for a while. Coleslaw is one of those things that I always thought I hated it, because whenever I've gotten it from a store, my family wasn't much into like cooking homemade, so I've only eaten coleslaw from stores, restaurants, grocery stores, those kinds of things, and I always just never liked it. It's just mushy. But when you make coleslaw at home, you get that crunchy texture, and I am so much into the texture of my food. I don't like mushy. And so making coleslaw at home was like a complete game changer for us. I actually started growing cabbage in the garden thinking, what am I going to make with this? I don't like coleslaw. But, it's one of those eye-opening things that when you start to grow a garden, you think to yourself, well, I don't like it at other places, or I don't like this vegetable when I buy it from the grocery store. But when you buy it or when you grow it, you find that you might like it more. Maybe it's a variety thing. Maybe it's the way that it's prepared or cooked. Well, that's what cabbage was for me. And the cool thing is cabbage is one of those vegetables that the lettuce in the garden has started to bolt, and I haven't started the lettuce yet in the arrow garden inside the house. So there's a period of time in the spring when we're out of lettuce and we actually start using this coleslaw as like our salads. And I change up the dressing so that it's like a Caesar dressing or it's a lemon basil dressing, and I just use the coleslaw as like our salad alternative, because the cabbage not only can be harvested a little bit later than the lettuce can after the lettuce is bolted, but cabbage keeps for a really, really long time in the refrigerator. I'm talking months. So in those couple of months where, it's gone in the garden, but it's still growing in the arrow garden inside, we eat cabbage as our salad alternative. So we're going to put our meat onto these little Hawaiian rolls. Once again, I didn't feel like making rolls from scratch, so there's no shame whatsoever in purchasing your bread products if you don't feel like making them all. I buy when I don't want to make, so never feel like you have to be doing it all. And then you just add that coleslaw to the top. That coleslaw has been sitting in the fridge, just getting wonderful and beautiful and tangy and tasty. And now we have these little pork sliders, and they are so good. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today, guys. Cooking in the kitchen using all of that garden harvest. Happy gardening and happy cooking.